Machine guns, minefields, armored vehicles, and hundreds of soldiers waiting behind layers of fortifications. Only hours before the attack, a veteran commander spotted a fatal flaw in the plan, a mistake that could have cost every attacker his life. What happened next became one of the most remarkable commando operations in Quang Dong's wartime memoirs. This is part 12. Breaking the strong point on the Saigon River. Strange things happen in war, sometimes. The difference between victory and disaster comes down to a single decision made at the last moment. Looking back now, I still believe that if we had followed our original plan, many of us might never have returned. In late 1972, our team was ordered to move to the Rachbap area along the Saigon River. The enemy had established a heavily fortified strongpoint there, blocking movement along the river and threatening our supply routes. Several units had already been operating nearby, but the position remained intact. Commander Bay assigned our team to reinforce the operation. There were only 5 of us. As always, we spent the next few days studying the target. Night after night, we crawled closer. The enemy strongpoint sat on slightly elevated ground overlooking the riverbank. Defensive positions were layered carefully. Bunkers covered one another with overlapping fields of fire. Machine gun nests watched every likely approach. Round them stretched belts of mines and obstacles. It was not a position that welcomed visitors. The reconnaissance work was exhausting. Every movement had to be measured, every footprint erased. Sometimes we spent more time removing traces of our presence than gathering information. One careless mistake could expose the entire operation before it even began. The more we learned, the more dangerous the target appeared. At first, the assault plan seemed straightforward. Strike fast, hit hard, break through before the enemy could react. Many of us believed it could work. Then Ansao arrived. Ansao listened quietly while the plan was explained. He asked a few questions, walked through the terrain, studied the enemy positions. Then he shook his head. No, just one word. No. The more he explained, the more uncomfortable we became. What had looked like a bold assault suddenly appeared reckless. We had focused on reaching the target. He focused on surviving after reaching it. That changed everything. The enemy's machine guns covered the approaches. The minefields slowed movement. The bunkers supported one another. Even if we reached the objective, extraction could become a nightmare. Instead of destroying the enemy, we risked being trapped inside their defensive system. 19 men could disappear there very quickly. Nobody argued after hearing the analysis, not because we lacked courage, but because the reasoning was impossible to ignore. A brave plan is not always a good plan. So we started over. Back to the beginning. Back to reconnaissance. Back to careful preparation. This time we focused on the minefields. The enemy had spent months building them. They trusted them. That trust would become their weakness. Night after night, we crawled forward, slowly, patiently, sometimes barely moving a few meters in an hour. The ground ahead was full of hidden surprises. One wrong touch and the entire operation would end in a flash of light. Removing enemy mines was delicate work. No one rushed. No one showed off. Every man knew that bravery meant nothing if you lost your hands before the battle even started. As the nights passed, pots began to appear through the minefields. Invisible pots, known only to us. The enemy believed their defenses remained untouched. They had no idea we were slowly dismantling the very shield protecting them. Some mines were removed, others were relocated. Still others were turned into surprises waiting for the wrong person to discover them. The battlefield was changing. The enemy simply didn't know it yet. What impressed me most was the patience of everyone involved. War stories often focus on explosions and gunfire, but many victories begin in silence. A man lying motionless in mud, another carefully probing the ground with his fingers, someone waiting hours for the right moment to move a single step. That was the reality. Eventually everything was ready. The routes were prepared, the obstacles weakened, the strong point studied from every angle. Now all that remained was the attack itself. As we waited for the final order, I remember looking toward the enemy position and thinking how confident they must have felt. Their bunkers were intact, their machine guns stood ready, their minefields appeared untouched. From their perspective, nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, everything had changed, and soon they were going to find out. Breaking the strong point on the Saigon River. For the next 2 nights, B and I did only one thing, clearing mines. On the 3rd night, we finally opened a path through the first barrier. On the fourth night, we breached the second one. The distance between the two fences was nearly 20 meters. The enemy had planted an astonishing variety of mines everywhere. Still, we had made progress. We could now crawl close enough to touch the sandbags of the outpost itself. But we did not go in. Taking unnecessary risks now would bring no advantage. On the fifth night, B and I returned once again. This time our mission was to map every target that needed to be destroyed during the assault. I have to admit, B moved like a lizard, fast, silent, and agile. I could barely keep up with him. Then our luck suddenly turned. We had just slipped through the first fence when, pop, a cluster of illumination flares shot into the sky, turning the entire area white. Caught completely by surprise, we immediately froze in place. There was no cover, no concealment, nothing. All we could do was lie motionless and pray. Whether the enemy had actually detected something, or was simply nervous and trigger happy, I never knew. But they kept firing flare after flare. 3 or 4 heavy machine guns opened up at once, sweeping the area around the outpost. The gunfire seemed to last forever. Then, finally, everything went quiet. Darkness returned. Neither of us felt safe anymore. We withdrew immediately. Still, we had already gathered enough information. That alone was a success. Back at base, we reported everything to Commander Cao and the rest of the unit. Based on our reconnaissance, we proposed an assault through the breach we had opened in the fence. Commander Cao listened carefully. Then he nodded, approved. To strengthen the attack, he assigned 2 additional B-40 gunners and 2 RPD light machine gunners to support us in case of an enemy counterattack. That evening we sat down for dinner. The meal was surprisingly good. Salted pork, boiled fresh fish, and our favorite sour leaf soup. While we were eating, Commander Cao suddenly looked at us and said, "Kids, I think Ba's plan is a little reckless." Everyone stared at him in confusion. Then he explained, "First, the outpost has the river at its back. All of you plan to attack from the forest. That means the enemy expects danger from exactly that direction. If things go wrong, your withdrawal route will be trapped between artillery fire and air strikes. Second, 3 of your B-40 teams are tied up covering the breach. That leaves only 7 riflemen in the main assault force. How are 7 AICs supposed to fight 100 hardened enemy troops? And third, your assault troops throw all their grenades and demolition charges. But how do you know the enemy will still be there? What if they're hiding somewhere else and simply waiting for you to run out of ammunition before counterattacking?" As he spoke, we felt a chill run down our spines. Our enthusiasm had nearly led us into a trap of our own making. We accepted Commander Cao's criticism immediately. The assault was postponed, and thank God for that. Without that dinner conversation, all 19 of us might have been killed. The next afternoon, using the low-angle sunlight, B, team leader Tuan, and I returned to observe the enemy position once more. Each of us selected a separate observation point more than 100 meters apart and counted the targets. There were too many firing ports to count. 3 M113 armored personnel carriers guarded the position, one at each end of the road, and another in the center. 4 DMC trucks sat neatly parked nearby, all facing toward Rachkeen Parish Church. From the forest edge to the enemy fence lay a belt of low brush, then open ground, and only after that came the defensive perimeter. There was only one direct approach, a deadly one. No cover, no concealment, no safe retreat. Yet that route offered one advantage: surprise. The enemy would never expect anyone to attack through such exposed terrain. The fence line facing the forest was heavily reinforced. Mines were everywhere. Most dangerous of all were the claymore mines hidden at the base of the fence beneath thin layers of grass. Whether we advanced or withdrew, the enemy could detonate them at will. Outside the fence alone, we had already recovered more than 20 small anti-personnel mines, and there were certainly many more we had not found. Just thinking about it made me shudder. Leaving Tuan on security, B and I spent 3 more nights quietly modifying the minefield. We turned enemy defenses against their owners. We rotated the claymores to face different directions. B proudly claimed he managed to turn 3 of them. I only succeeded with 1. By then, the obstacle belt was almost completely cleared. Not perfectly safe. Nothing in war ever is, but wide enough for our men to move in and out if necessary. The night of the attack arrived. Every man blackened his skin and carried only essential equipment. Each B-40 gunner carried 6 rockets. AK riflemen carried 5 magazines. The RPD gunners carried only 2 belts of ammunition. Light fast, ready. We kept the original three-pronged attack plan. My group received an additional B-40 gunner and would strike across the most exposed section of open ground. Bay's group would attack from below. Tuan's team would attack from above, supported by both RPD machine guns, to avoid becoming trapped. Every fighter stayed 10 to 15 meters apart. No one was allowed to enter the enemy wire. The B-40 gunners would stop as soon as they reached effective firing range. Then everyone waited for H-hour. At 10 o'clock that night, the enemy fired their first illumination flare. For us, it felt like a gift from heaven. The bright light revealed every target. Immediately, I gave the order to fire. The first AK volleys dropped the sentries. At the same moment, the B-40 teams opened fire. After launching two rockets, the B-40 gunners went completely silent. The AK riflemen continued firing carefully at the bunker loopholes. Whether they hit anything or not, I couldn't tell, but their disciplined two-shot bursts showed remarkable composure under pressure. The enemy soldiers began emerging from their bunkers to return fire. Immediately, B-40 rockets smashed into them and forced them back down. Before they could recover, the B-40 gunners sprang up and emptied the rest of their rockets into the position. Then they withdrew at once. Next came the AKs and the two RPD machine guns. Long bursts hammered the outpost. The RPD gunners fired as if ammunition were free. Under that storm of fire, the enemy barely dared raise their heads. B and I were the last men to leave. We waited. The moment the enemy began firing back, B calmly grabbed a parachute cord that had been prepared earlier and pulled hard. The enemy fence shook violently. Then, the mines started exploding, one after another. A chain reaction of deafening blasts. The noise was overwhelming, exactly like an infantry unit blasting open a fortified obstacle belt. Amid the continuous explosions, we ran for our lives. We reached home before dawn. Commander Cao and the rest of the unit were still awake, waiting for us. He rushed over and personally checked each man, touching shoulders, arms, and faces as if making sure we were all still alive. Then he shouted joyfully, "This is the first battle in my entire military career without a single casualty. What a victory!" The entire unit erupted with excitement. At last, Commander Cao's men had avenged the earlier ambush carried out by those ranger troops. And after suffering this surprise attack, the enemy never dared establish another outpost there again. The cost of false optimism. After returning to our secondary base near Do Tieng, we were finally able to enjoy 3 proper days of Tet in early 1973. There was Ben Tet, which tasted almost identical to the northern Ben Chung, boiled pork, stir-fried bean sprouts, and the traditional sour soup made with canned fish. Unfortunately, I had only recently recovered from malaria. Everything tasted bitter. A cadre from the sub-region headquarters, known to us simply as Chen, I no longer remember his real name, came to celebrate Tet with us. He announced, "The Americans on our side have signed the Paris Agreement. Both sides have agreed to stop fighting. Peace may be near. If the negotiations succeed and national reconciliation becomes a reality, we may finally be able to go home." And Chen spoke at length about many other topics, but most of us listened with one ear and let it pass out the other. Not because we disliked political discussions, far from it. The problem was that what we saw every day told a completely different story. The enemy was still probing forward, still trying to seize territory. President Nguyen Van Thieu was still publicly calling for a campaign to flood the territory and occupy as much ground as possible. Enemy forces from Lai Khe and Dongdu continued pushing outward, searching villages and forests. Bombs and artillery shells still fell on any place they suspected might shelter Viet Cong forces. How were we supposed to believe in their goodwill? And there was another reason. After the defection of political commissar Tam Ha, many of us found it difficult to accept simple slogans like, "We are winning, the enemy is losing." From our perspective, the reality looked very different. Since 1968, both sides had been locked in a brutal struggle, a fight that often felt like, "If you survive, I die. If I survive, you die." Neither side seemed willing to give an inch. Why would the enemy suddenly hand victory to us now? Many of us believed they were simply buying time, nothing more. Too many comrades had already fallen. Too much blood had been spilled. The idea of reconciliation with the Saigon regime felt impossible to imagine. After Chen left, only our own men remained. That was when Commander Bei finally spoke his mind. "We must trust the leadership." He paused. "But we must not become naive. We understood exactly what he meant. Commander Bay had spent his entire adult life in the revolution. Like all of us, he dreamed of seeing his family again one day, even if it was only to find surviving brothers and sisters after years of separation. That longing never disappeared. But dreams were one thing, reality was another. None of us allowed ourselves to indulge in false hopes. Deep down, we knew the hardships were far from over. About 2 weeks after Tet, once the unit had recovered its strength, we returned to our old base in Long Nguyen. Fortunately, only a few artillery shells had landed near the area while we were gone. None had struck our bunkers. There were no signs of enemy intrusion. The greatest loss was our minefields. Several mines had been detonated by random artillery fire. In an odd way, the enemy's shells had done our own demolition work for us, tearing apart part of the base defenses we had spent so much effort constructing. After 3 days of rest, Commander Bay assigned everyone new missions. The war, apparently, had no intention of stopping. Commander Bay disguised himself as a civilian and traveled into Benkat and Lai Hung to study the Lai K area. I was sent toward Kukai to gather information about Dong Du, while also strengthening our bases near Nfu and Huanduk, and to manage to slip into Thudo Mot town through one of our local contacts. Team leader Kin stayed behind to manage the base. Tai led teams collecting rice and explosives. Everyone had a job. Whenever we returned from reconnaissance missions, we drew maps and briefed the entire unit. Possible combat scenarios were discussed in detail. Every option, every risk, every route in and out. Nothing was left to chance. Commander Bay and I were responsible for producing reconnaissance maps of Lai K and Dong Du for higher headquarters. One day, 5 senior officers arrived to review our reports. That was when things became frustrating. They wanted exact descriptions of Dong Du's defensive belts, exact measurements, exact layouts, exact details. I presented my findings once, then a second time. Still they kept pressing for more. One issue in particular seemed to bother them. I explained that even the internal housing areas were protected by additional barriers and defensive obstacles. The officers kept questioning me about it. Again, and again, and again. Finally, I lost my patience, not because they were asking questions. Questions were their job. The problem was that they were asking for a level of detail that was nearly impossible to obtain in the real world. Editor's note: Dong Du was one of the largest and most heavily fortified military bases in South Vietnam, covering roughly 8 square kilometers. A commando reconnaissance team did not survey an entire base. Instead, they infiltrated a very narrow sector, often only a specific approach route that might be used in a future attack. Gathering information from even that small area could take days or weeks. The goal was not to map the entire base, but to learn enough to survive and complete a mission. Dong Du was enormous. It took me nearly 2 weeks to penetrate only a tiny section of its defenses. To get there, I had crawled through tangled wire obstacles, single fences, double fences, cage fences, low tripwire barriers, minefields, and a defensive ditch 2 to 3 meters wide and deeper than a man's reach. And after all that effort, I had only reached a very small corner of the base, a tiny corner, nothing more. At night, powerful floodlights turned the place into daylight. Patrols moved constantly. One careless movement meant death. Who in his right mind would push deeper than necessary? On my final night inside the perimeter, I managed to remain there for perhaps 30 minutes before withdrawing. 30 minutes. That was all, and even that felt like an eternity. Anyone who claims he could wander around inside Dong Du for hours, studying every fence and every bunker, well, he's lying. Getting past the searchlights and the guards on the watchtowers was already difficult enough. That was exactly why we never sent 2 men into the same target area. If someone had to die, one was already too many. Yet the officers continued asking, how long was the fence? How wide? What types of mines were used? How were they arranged? Finally, I snapped. If the commanders want exact answers, I said, then come inside Dong Du with me and see for yourselves. The room fell silent. The officers looked at one another. No one said a word after they left. Enter laughed and said, you argue too much. Then he grinned. But I have to admit, you scared the hell out of them. He wasn't entirely serious. Neither was I. The truth was that everyone understood what entering Dong Du really meant. Once you had crawled through those defenses yourself, you stopped asking impossible questions. The truth was that only one man had ever managed to hit Dong Du properly. Back in 1968, General Quang, commander of the Southern Special Forces, had organized a major attack that truly shook the base. After that, no one achieved anything on the same scale. Once the South Vietnamese army took over the former American installation, they reinforced it heavily. The defenses became even stronger. In reality, only long-range artillery rockets such as DKBS and H-12s could reliably reach deep inside the base. For special forces to attack Dong Du directly would require an entire regiment. For infantry, it would take massive artillery preparation, hundreds of shells just to suppress the defenses before an assault could even begin. Some units had managed to sneak reconnaissance teams inside, but from what we heard, none of those efforts produced much. In short, Dong Du was a very difficult target. Our unit was simply too small, so we waited for the enemy to leave the safety of their fortress. Only then did we strike. As we used to say, a small cat catches small mice. Editor's note: this was a common battlefield way of thinking among small commando units. The phrase did not mean fear or weakness. It meant choosing targets that matched the size and capabilities of the force available. Rather than attacking a massive fortified base head-on, a small unit would wait for enemy patrols, reconnaissance teams, or isolated detachments to move outside their defenses, where surprise and mobility could be used to advantage. Every day, a three-man reconnaissance team led by an who patrolled the forest edges. They moved along the approaches to Ben Cat District, Lai Hung, and Ndine, watching for enemy activity. When we returned, and who often had stories to tell, some were hard to believe. Several times, local guerrillas from Ben Cat openly carried liberation flags in broad daylight. They walked around without fear of enemy aircraft. When and who asked what they were doing, they answered, "We're planting flags to claim territory." I couldn't help wondering whether confidence was slowly turning into carelessness. Other days, the reconnaissance team ran into groups of regular North Vietnamese soldiers returning from the villages. The men carried rifles casually over their shoulders and proudly claimed they had just been drinking coffee with South Vietnamese troops. According to them, the enemy soldiers had even given them fragrant cigarettes, coffee, sugar, and cans of condensed milk. The stories sounded exaggerated, maybe even completely made up, but they still made us uneasy, very uneasy. One day Anhu suggested, maybe we should visit one of the villages ourselves, and Deem immediately shook his head. Those fellows can go into the villages and come back alive. He snorted, we try it, and we might end up as somebody's dinner. I simply smiled. I didn't agree. I didn't disagree. The line between peace and war had become dangerously thin. If I nodded and approved the idea, and the enemy happened to surround us inside a village, would any of us make it back out alive? On the other hand, if we stayed away, how could we know what was really happening? In the end, silence was the safest answer. Without orders, nobody acted. Nobody took chances. That decision saved us. Our unit never entered the villages. Our base remained completely secret. By late April, the enemy forces at Lai Khe and Ben Cat finally showed their true intentions. They turned hostile again. Artillery began falling on areas that had been treated as safe only a few months earlier. Some of those locations had welcomed civilians during Tet. People had gathered there. Fires had been lit. Celebrations had been held to mark the signing of the Paris Agreement. Many genuinely believed peace was coming. Then the shells started falling. Reality returned. Brutally, looking back, the price paid for that kind of false optimism was far higher than anyone could afford. Malaria, the enemy we feared more than the commandos. About a week after returning from Than Thien and preparing for our next operation, disaster struck the unit. It came in the form of malaria, a ruthless enemy that launched its own offensive against us. Within weeks, nearly the entire unit had lost its combat effectiveness. For almost 2 months, our lives became a cycle of evading enemy sweeps and battling malaria. Hard times indeed. People who looked at everything through a rigid, textbook mindset often dismissed malaria sufferers as men pretending to be sick, or suffering from some sort of mental weakness. We knew better. To us, malaria was more frightening than fighting enemy commandos at close quarters. Only a few days remained before the Paris Peace Agreement would be signed on January 27, 1973. The enemy seemed determined to gain as much ground as possible before then. Deep penetration operations. Pushed into the forests. Jet aircraft dropped bombs. Helicopters filled the sky, transporting troops and firing in every direction. Artillery shells landed day and night, often without any obvious target. Our base also came under shell fire. We were forced to move to a secondary position near Do Tiang. Right in the middle of those enemy operations, Du collapsed with malaria. Then Deem. Then one man after another. Before long, more than half the unit was down. I was among them. At first, a few men developed fever and managed to stop it with medicine. A week later, the disease spread through the unit. We found ourselves overwhelmed. The chills would come first, then the burning fever. Afterward, the body seemed normal again, but strength disappeared rapidly. Some men could barely drag their feet. Their hands shook so badly they could hardly hold anything. Their vision blurred. Even simple thirst became torture. Commander Bay sent N2 to sub-region headquarters to request medical assistance. When he arrived, some official whose position none of us ever learned replied, "You must bring the patients here. Every unit is asking for help. How can we possibly deal with all of them? If they develop severe malaria because you delayed evacuation, who will take responsibility?" It was the sort of answer that left a bitter taste in your mouth, but what could we do? Living in remote jungle conditions took a terrible toll on the body. The unhealthy environment wore people down. Editor's note: the Vietnamese expression Nguok describes the physical exhaustion and weakness that can occur when a person struggles to adapt to a new climate, environment, water source, food, or living conditions. It is not a specific disease, but it often leaves people vulnerable to illness and infection. Malaria left its mark on everyone. Lips turned dark, eyes became pale, faces hollowed out. Men grew thin and gaunt. Even carrying an AK rifle felt like carrying a sack of stones at times. All you wanted to do was throw it away. The Americans and South Vietnamese used to joke that 7 Viet Cong could hang from a papaya stalk without breaking it. There was some truth to that. We really did become frighteningly thin. But there was something strange about malaria. The moment enemy troops appeared, the illness seemed to vanish. Fear disappeared, weakness disappeared, and suddenly we were ready to fight again. No hesitation, no complaints. Back in 1969 and 1970, Long Nguyen had military medical stations, civilian clinics, and larger field hospitals farther away. By 1973, most of them had been forced to relocate because of enemy operations. Nobody knew where they had gone. Only one medical unit remained somewhere in the Long Nguyen Than and Do Tiang area. Commander Bay knew where they were. Unfortunately, they were already overflowing with wounded and sick soldiers. Even strong men suffered. When malaria struck, Dean groaned in pain. His teeth chattered so violently that you could hear them knocking together. Long, our cook, became so sick he could barely prepare meals. He sat beside the warm home camp stove shivering uncontrollably. Fortunately, he was cooking rice porridge. At least it didn't matter if it turned mushy. Team leader Kin shook so badly he could not lift a bowl of hot water to his lips. Tai fell unconscious for 3 straight days. When he finally woke up, he asked for water. Someone handed him a canteen. Within seconds, he had emptied the entire thing. My own fever lasted 5 days without a break. I became so weak my vision blurred constantly. I needed 2 walking sticks just to move around. When the unit had to relocate during enemy sweeps, the others carried me in a hammock. Even then, flowers and stars seemed to explode before my eyes. Hu and Tai took turns caring for the 3 of us. Then both of them fell sick too. Soon 4 of us lay together groaning. Only Du, who had just recovered, was left to look after everyone. Tai's team had 3 men down. Kin's team had 2. Fortunately, only one member of N2's team, the sniper Din, became ill. As a result, N2's men ended up carrying almost the entire workload of the unit. Malaria lingered. It never seemed to leave completely. Some men developed fevers before sunrise. Others shook with chills in the afternoon. After the chills came waves of burning heat and sweat. Many became so miserable they wanted to throw themselves into a stream. Some men groaned loudly enough to be heard across the camp. Others curled up in their hammocks, beneath a single thin parachute cloth, their only blanket against the cold. My team took down our hammocks and built nests from jungle leaves, half fresh, half dry. We lay together for warmth. The body heat of comrades helped a little, just a little. There was one thing I never forgot. Whenever soldiers became seriously ill, they called for their mothers, every single one of them. Team leader Kim became delirious with fever. Again and again he cried, "Mother, I'm so cold." Even Commander Bay, who had lost his parents as a child, was no different. During his fever he called out, "Mom, Mom, I'm sick, Mom." It wasn't just our unit. Soldiers from other units told similar stories. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps when a man suffers enough, he returns to the place where he once felt safest. At that time, we were issued quinine tablets to prevent malaria. Later, new anti-malaria medicines known as Prevention No. 1 and Prevention No. 2 arrived from the north. Each soldier received only a few treatment courses. It was nowhere near enough. By mid-1972, we were also issued DDS tablets to take alongside the malaria medicine. The hope was that it would help stop the attacks more quickly. It didn't. The fevers kept coming. Tablets alone were not enough. What we really needed were injections. 3 days of injections at minimum, sometimes 5. But injectable medicine was desperately scarce. Malaria was only one of many diseases that could kill a man in the jungle. There were worse things: dysentery, jaundice, severe edema, especially when the swelling reached the face or abdomen, persistent hiccups, and the disease we feared most of all, hemoglobinuria, or, as we called it, urinating blood. Editor's note: the soldiers referred to this condition as hemoglobinuria or blood urine malaria. It was a severe complication of malaria that caused massive destruction of red blood cells, severe anemia, jaundice, and acute kidney failure. In remote jungle conditions, it was often regarded as a death sentence. A man suffering from it could weaken dramatically within only a few days. Once the disease reached that stage, there was often very little anyone could do. Fortunately for us, Commander Bay was something of a field medic himself. Over the years he had collected countless survival tricks from older veterans. One of his favorite remedies resembled the traditional herb known as Xyantamline. His mixture contained Kogan grass roots, kimkang leaves, koswok, lemongrass, and another extremely bitter leaf whose name I never learned. Commander Bay called it the basic prescription. According to him, the formula had survived 9 years of resistance against the French. That alone was enough to earn our respect. Whenever someone showed signs of hemoglobinuria, we immediately gave him American-made vitamin K tablets, originally intended to stop bleeding from battlefield wounds, and forced him to drink concentrated decoctions made from Kogan grass roots. To be honest, our methods were closer to battlefield improvisation than modern medicine. A little of this, a little of that, whatever we could find, yet somehow, people recovered. Later, professionally trained medical officers scolded us. They called us reckless, men who didn't know enough to be afraid. Perhaps they were right, but out in the jungle, caught between life and death, criticism meant very little. Saving a comrade came first. The arguments could wait until later, if there was a later. By the end of March 1973, the unit finally began recovering. Only then did two medical officers from sub-region headquarters decide to pay us a visit. They inspected the camp, looked around, asked questions, then delivered their conclusion. Poor hygiene, mosquitoes, unsanitary living conditions. The unit needed to do this, needed to do that, needed to improve A, B, and C. We listened and quietly boiled with frustration. What they said wasn't entirely wrong, but none of it changed the reality we faced every day. Commander Bay asked for injectable medicine. That was what we desperately needed. The medical officers nodded and said they would take note. In the end, they left us with a little over 100 anti-malaria tablets, several hundred vitamin B1 pills, and a small amount of bandages. Then they disappeared, completely. Editor's note: Mr. Dong uses a Vietnamese expression roughly, meaning vanished like an eel into the mud. It describes someone disappearing so completely that no trace of them can be found. We didn't see them again for the rest of the year. When they finally reappeared near the end of 1973, the story they brought with them was almost unbelievable. As we prepared for the 1973 to 1974 dry season campaign, several officers from sub-region headquarters arrived with replacement troops. During conversations around the camp, they told us what had happened. Nobody knew exactly how. Nobody seemed able to explain it clearly. But somehow those two medical officers had wandered into territory controlled by the South Vietnamese army and been captured. Fortunately, the enemy did not shoot them. Instead, They became prisoners. Later, through one arrangement or another, they were eventually released at Loc Ninh and made it back alive. Neither of them returned to their old assignments. The full story was apparently much longer and much stranger. The officers who told it claimed there were all sorts of twists and turns along the way, but we never paid much attention to the details. We simply laughed. Commander Bay often said that no one was a master of the battlefield. The jungle had a way of humbling everyone, a veteran, a doctor, a commander, anyone. If you survive long enough, it was usually because you listened to those who had already learned the hard lessons before you. Old veterans, local guides, experienced scouts. Ignoring them could be fatal. As for us, we preferred a simpler philosophy. Life had its own destiny. Take a few risks. Look after one another, and perhaps fate would spare you. Malaria had nearly broken us. Yet even then, we treated it as just another hardship to overcome. Another test, another enemy. Before long, the fevers faded, strength returned, the rifles felt lighter again, and once more, we prepared to go back into the fight. We knew perfectly well that we were once again playing games with death, but that was nothing new. It was simply part of being a soldier. In the end, we survived the malaria. The fevers faded, the rifles felt lighter again, and before long, we were back in the jungle, hunting the enemy once more. We knew we were playing games with death, but to us, that was simply normal life. And so, once again, we picked up our rifles and returned to the war. This is where part 12 comes to an end. Thank you for joining us and listening to Quang Dong's Memoirs. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you again in the next chapter. Thank you, and goodbye for now.